Today I want to talk about the relationship between being and non-being, if there is such a relationship, and the relationship between being as such, or being in itself, or the ontological principle, sometimes being qua being, as Aristotle puts it, and others, uh, in relation to being as something in particular, like a particular being. The example I'll probably use throughout the video is being as a plate. First, let's talk about what being is. Being refers to that which is, something that is real. I like to use it basically as synonymous with reality itself. Sometimes people use the word existent to refer to kind of like ecstasis, like besides oneself type of connotation or denotation. But usually that refers to just reality anyways. But let's just say the reality principle is the principle of being, is the ontological principle. And more specifically, what that entails is what is the fundamental principle between anything that is real? What is it essentially? What is it that allows for reality? Ultimately, reality has to be one thing, as Chris Langan articulates with his syndiphionesis, which means difference in sameness. If you have two different things, two distinct defined things, they are necessitatively related by a medium because you are, in fact, identifying the difference, two related things. The relation implicates some kind of principal similarity that the two different things can be reduced to. You can do this with immaterial things as well, if we are to posit multiple plural metaphysical principles. So ultimately, the reality principle would be the one fundamental monistic reality principle that underlies and ultimately needs to substantiate all difference and plurality. There can't be two reality principles because you're saying they're both real and predicating multiple reality principles. Therefore, they would both be subsumed into a single reality principle. Recently, I've been thinking about, and admittedly, perhaps extrapolating too much out of a dialectic between a kind of Parmenidean monism and Platonism. And it's a very specific thing. It's on the question of non-being, but the way that it's kind of extended, perhaps beyond the quip or the quarrel that Parmenideans have with Platonism regarding non-being, because Parmenidean monism, I mean, one of the first things Parmenides talks about in his only surviving fragment, which is a poem called On Nature, is basically a warning against concept reification, against the reification of non-being as a thing at all, like that should even be considered in any context, which has some substance to it for sure, because it is, I mean, you're saying it's a completely negative term. You can't predicate anything of it. Whereas Platonism may not predicate anything of it, but it does use the term, and I think Parmenideans have a gripe against that. And I think that is because Platonism, in identifying what is actually ontic or ontological, like for instance, Plotinus with his three hypostases in treatment of evil, the three hypostases, the one, the intellect, and the soul, doesn't extend to, I would see that as his ontological ladder, right? It doesn't extend to materiality. Therefore, materiality is kind of treated as that which is not. I think that's kind of the catalyst for the Parmenidean reaction. And again, this isn't like a big dialect. It's something I've observed and thought about a lot, and I think it's a useful one, so that's why I'm talking about it. And there is something to that. However, the way it's extended essentially to the equation of any particular something, right? Any particular real thing to the reality principle itself. And to put this in terms of being, this would be being as something, let's say being as the plate, would basically be equated to being as such, or being in itself, right? Well, let's dive into that. Can the plate as a plate, literally, be the reality principle itself? Well, you could say no, you could say yes, but then why isn't plateness fundamental? Why isn't everything a plate? Why doesn't everything partake of plateness specifically? Why isn't reality just a freeze frame of a plate, if that's the case? I think a good argument against this would be that we are dividing up things unnecessarily. We're creating definition where there need not be definition. It's not ultimately a sound response, and I'll get into why, but I think it is one of the better responses, that we're actually creating difference out of nothing, where there is no difference, and we're actually seeing boundaries where there are none. However, that doesn't account for even the appearance of boundaries. Now, your first question when I first started talking about the reality principle being a singular, unitary, monic thing could have been, well, how does that account for difference and distinction? And that's a good question. That is basically, answering that question is essentially mapping out metaphysics, or the operation of that one thing unto itself. And some people answer this question via a kind of a total negation of all particularity, which in a sense is correct, but it also still doesn't account for particularity. You can negate something as not fundamentally real and therefore not have to treat it in a way that you would treat something with ontological status. However, you still have to account for even the appearance of something that isn't real, or the appearance of, well, basically distinction, definition, or difference in a reality system that is predicated to ultimately be unitary, indifferent, or rather undifferentiated, etc., and so on. Now, the total equation of any given object, and I want to mostly treat materiality here because this is the most obvious, realm of difference and distinction that we experience objectively, externally, the external material world, right? Of course, we could, get into later how souls or different minds are not material things, and these things are also different, and they even have conditions that are not material, but are also distinct. But let's deal with materiality first, because it's the most interesting in this context. So if you take this kind of, and I should actually clarify that this might not have been Parmenides' view on the topic. However, I'm just going to colloquially use the Parmenidean position, I'm going to refer to it as that, of the equation of any particular object to the reality principle itself doubly fails to account for even the appearance of distinction. Why is it that you can even make out any difference? Why is it that you can render any definition, any distinction, even if it isn't, fundamentally real? Why is it that there are, with materiality, that's one thing, but why is it that there's a multiplicity of conscious focal points or minds or souls? How would that occur? By what mechanism does something that has no capacity to rank or organize or account for difference, by what mechanism would it do that? If we just kind of go the total opposite route of total negation, do a total equation of everything into the reality principle, which I guess would be a kind of the opposite of apophaticism, cataphauticism. But as you can see, there's kind of the same problem with both of them, is that they fail to account for particularity. I wrote in a tweet some weeks ago that a truly universal reality system has to account for particularity. If it doesn't, if a particular is beyond it, it is no longer universal. Something that is truly universal basically has to be absolute, has to account for and contain all particulars within itself in a way such that the universal actually isn't reduced thereto. And it doesn't seem like it would need to be reduced thereto. I haven't ever heard a good argument as to why that would have to be the case. Now, to kind of offer my own opinions on the matter, my own modeling on the matter, my own thoughts, there is a way in which you can have, phenomenal material objects as not ontological. However, it still isn't right, and it doesn't really bring up the right connotation to relegate it to non being, rather, as a kind of phenomena itself that should be treated in the context of what is fundamentally real as something it does. And we don't have to assume that the objective, or not objective, I don't want to create any confusion here, the phenomenal material world and any, instance of material, let's say the plate, is actually an external phenomenal thing, and that there is actually an external world. And I'm not talking about solipsism, I'm just talking about idealism. And that rather, materiality is just the way that more like, it could be viewed more like the registration of perception of a kind of immaterial condition to the subject or to the mind. And this doesn't mean that there's only one mind. I mean, ultimately, there can be one mind that contains microcosmic minds, you could say. It contains individuated minds. There's even, I forget exactly who, it might be Donald Hoffman, had some work on how even human minds have been shown to be able to contain individuated minds. But I'm not going to get into that. The point really is that just because we're not trying to negate anything, like in a very severe, strict way, doesn't mean we have to reify our conception of something according to that conception. So that's the other half of concept reification. We might have a concept of what something is. That concept might not be accurate. It may not be situating what it is we're observing relative to the extent it actually exists. It could be of something else. So my alternative, I've kind of started calling it ontological situationalism. And I always come up with these really pretentious, inane names as placeholders just to make it very obvious what I'm talking about, as to what I'm talking about, until I create something better. But the idea is that you're situating something that cannot be fundamentally real in itself. And key word, we have to stipulate fundamentally. We're not really calling it unreal per se. We're just situating it in the context and according to and contained by something that is. And this can occur at scale, kind of like how Plotinus has the hypostases. The one prepossesses the intellect, which prepossesses, the soul in a way. And that's obviously ranked, I would look at it as concentric circles. In fact, Plotinus, no, it's not concentric circles, but he has it kind of mapped out as, yes, kind of a concentric circle, but a point and then a circle that is immovable or not moving, and then a circle around that which is like an arrow and is turning around on itself, and that would be soul. He actually describes that in the Enneads. Not that Plotinus's treatment of matter is entirely accurate. I have my own disagreement with it, mostly that he doesn't even seem to account for it in the context of what is real. What he calls matter, he does, kind of. But he doesn't refer to matter in the way that we think of materiality. There's like a different context. It's a different definition, really. But in any case, the relationship between being as something has to be, well, for one, being as something, let's say the plate, has to be clarified not as the fundamental being principle literally transmuting itself into the plate, although almost paradoxically, but not really, it is permeated thereby, it is contained thereby. It only exists in context or in reference to the reality principle, but it's not actually that reality principle transmuted into, a book or a plate or whatever. And that's because the plate isn't actually a ontological thing that is there. It is just the perception of a kind of like a thought form, um, an immaterial condition. So, to explain the way I would model this a little bit more thoroughly, I would suppose and propose that reality is a universal mind. This is kind of not exactly what Neoplatonism is getting at, but I'm not 100% a Neoplatonist either. That reality is ultimately a universal mind, and of course, mind isn't its operation. So I think that when I've talked with Neoplatonists, that's kind of the argument that's given, is that because thinking supposes the thinking subject and the object of thought, as well as actually the thought process, which I do agree with, you still have to have a thinker or mind that precedes this, operation. So it doesn't necessarily make sense that there has to be an apophotic, like, in that context, an apophotic one prior to a mind that then gives way to the operation of nous or the intellect, because you already need a bare mind to precede thinking. It prepossesses the ability to think and to produce the objects of thought, but you're already predicating that in the hypostatic model, in my view. Of course, my view could be wrong, but in any case, I'm supposing that there is a universal mind, that this universal mind does prepossess the ability to think and to produce the objects of thought in a kind of phantasmal way, and it can involve itself in these objects of thought. Of course, the very first rank of this process would be similar to how it's described in Platonism, wherein the intellect is kind of internally engaging or engaged with the intelligibles, and it's not a process that like registers in time. It's not a temporal process. It's just self-thinking subject, right? It's mind thinking itself, which still has to be, ultimately mind thinking itself would still need a basis of mind in itself, not thinking itself just as itself. But I would say that as this process continues and you have the objects of thought, which would initially, so suppose there is a way that the mind is, fundamentally, there's a way reality is, and I'm supposing that the reality principle is the mind. The first objects of thought of this, mind thinking of itself would be in close proximity to that condition, to that metastructure, so to speak. And you would have these kind of thought objects that aren't actually the structures themselves, just renditions thereof, because they're just, in a similar manner as you could imagine something or think of your own mind and register a thought based on the way it's structured and not reduce your mind to that given thought. Like, for instance, you can't reduce your mind as your mind to a given image in your imagination. If you imagine a plate, you can't actually reduce your mind to the image of that plate. So think in similar lines as that. Nonetheless, they would be very close approximation to that metastructure of the mind, which is the kind of objective way that it is, which happens to be a subjectivity. And you don't have to actually extricate those two, when it comes to fundamental reality. I guess you could say the monad, or maybe the one. And then and that's basically the advent of particularization and plurality. And the reason that is because as soon as you have an object of thought, it has definition, which means it has to have relation to other instances of definition. Because as soon as you've defined one thing, you've defined other things. So definition incurs relation. Or you could say condition incurs relation, which gets into my theory of definitionalism or auto-definitional idealism, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but it's self-definition in reality is something I talk about quite a lot in my other works. But that's exactly why plurality has to be incurred as soon as you have this kind of thought process, which kind of perfectly wraps up plurality in unity and contained by unity, in my opinion. But, anyways, you'd have this first rank of plurality of these plural conditions, and then you would have a composition thereof as you continue, as you know, as the thought process continues. This would just be the eternal one, and then perhaps different forms of composition would, or different arrangements of the composition of these, you could say maybe forms. The Platonic forms is kind of, I think, a similar idea of these thought objects, these fundamental, or not fundamental, these primary thought objects arranging themselves in different compositions could be, well, would basically contribute to the increase in particularity as reality, continues down the ontological scale. And the reason it becomes ontological, it's not to say that the objects are, but it is to say that the mind individuates on a basis of self-involvement, on the basis of involution. So individuation is incurred by involution. So suppose you have increasingly particular, like, thought conditions rendered or thought of by this more universal mind. As these conditions are thought of, they can then be thought from. So you have the intellection, and then you have the involution. I would say that this is also an intrinsic capacity of that mental reality principle, this self-involving capacity. Thinking of something is not necessarily the exact same thing as thinking from that position, from that condition, so to speak, from that condition of defined reality. That is what creates individuation. That's what creates souls, the plurality of souls. And you could even have more universal souls contained by more particular souls. And the souls, of course, being kind of individuations of this universal mind and possessing basically its attributes, would be rendering the conditions that it's involved with, or really, this involution and individuation is occurring in tandem. So it's involved with these conditions, it's also perceiving them. And I would just relegate materiality to the mode, or really the phenomena of that perception. And I guess you could say material phenomena would be, you know, like a self-reference to that phenomena that is actually just it perceiving these conditions. And of course, these conditions are incredibly composite, very complex on our level of reality. I would say that the way you could say maybe objective reality in the context, objective in the context of the objects of thought, not like objective as in concrete. The original Greek for object meant going through, whereas subject meant going under. So the underlying principle versus, what it's going through, I think is a fun way to think of those two terms. But objective in that sense would basically be characterized by an increase in composition of condition, which increases the definition. You could think of it like a more universal thing, which contains more particular things by definition, necessarily, is actually less defined of a thing. It's a more nebulous thing, whereas a more particular thing is a more defined thing, meaning it's probably more composite. It's probably more composed of different, more universal things, right? You could say, like, if, let's just suppose, my voice was giving out for a second there, sorry about that. Let's just suppose that white and red are two universal conditions, then pink would have to be the composition of those two conditions. Not to say that they actually are, but as an example. But to wrap this video up, because it's gone on quite a bit longer than I thought it would, essentially, yes, non-being is not a thing. However, an object isn't being in itself. It exists only in the context of being. Just because it isn't what we conceptualize it as doesn't mean that it actually is non-being. This is just kind of a misleading thing. Not super inaccurate, I would say, but it's misleading, and I think it creates more confusion than perhaps a better articulation of things. I would say it isn't being in itself, but it's also not being transmuted. Literally, like mind doesn't actually, if we're gonna, suppose and argue for monistic idealism, mind isn't actually transmuted into the plate. You know, it's not the mind platified, because then that means that, as below, so above. Some people don't like that, but it is actually true in a lot of ways. The plate has to be able to be cast back onto reality, and the plate just doesn't possess any of the ontological properties besides appearing. But then you're reifying the appearance of something as what it has to be essentially, or what actually is going on. And materiality isn't actually just an increase in the ontological progression, or I guess it's not a layer of that ontological progression. It's just something that is occurring internal to that progression, and it's not actually, it's simply the case, it's not that, the plate is non-being, but the plate isn't a discrete stuff thing that is external to the mind that we are perceiving in a dualistic universe. So that's my thoughts on it. Let me know what you think. I know videos like this can be kind of messy, and it went on a lot longer than I thought it would. However, I think it's a good way to kind of put these thoughts out there. I also noticed that some of these topics I'm getting into are so, I don't want to say specialized, but they're kind of, they're very interesting to me, but they're becoming less relatable, more particular to a certain understanding and like framework of metaphysics. So maybe I should kind of introduce it a little bit better. But yeah, let me know what you think. If you share this around, I would appreciate it. If you know people who can value from this kind of discussion. And yeah, have a week ahead.